My cousin started visiting Grandpa every night. So I pulled the notarized will from the safe. 2 weeks later, he said it was all his. The notary exposed the amendment. I am 35, a high school history teacher in Ohio, living a quiet life with steady paychecks and long weekends of lesson planning and football games. Grandpa Harold raised me when my parents split. He was a retired firefighter, the kind of man who fixed his own roof at 70 and still called gas stations service stations. My cousin Brandon, 33, was always the smooth talker, the one who sold sneakers out of his trunk and called it entrepreneurship. He loved shortcuts while Grandpa loved principles. For years, Brandon never called Grandpa birthdays, holidays, nothing. Then one spring, he started showing up every few days, smoothies and hand flowers tucked under his arm, talking about how family mattered more than anything. Grandpa melted every time he would call me afterward, saying Brandon had matured, that he was proud of how responsible he sounded. I wanted to believe him, but every story Grandpa told ended with Brandon mentioning money or paperwork. The first real red flag came on a Sunday afternoon when I decided to visit without warning. Grandpa's driveway was not empty. Brandon's new Tesla sat gleaming like it owned the place. Through the living room window, I saw Brandon flipping through envelopes, his hand resting on a pile of mail. The second he noticed me, he froze, then forced that salesman grin. I asked what he was doing. He said he was helping Grandpa get organized. Grandpa nodded with a confused smile, saying Brandon had been such a big help lately. That night, I could not sleep. Grandpa had been forgetting small things lately, leaving the stove on, misplacing checks, mixing updates. The idea of Brandon handling his finances made my stomach twist. I started paying attention, dropping by more often. Brandon always seemed to be there already, once watering plants, another time cooking lunch. He said he just wanted Grandpa to eat healthy. Grandpa thought it was sweet. I thought it was rehearsed. One evening, I overheard Brandon talking about simplifying accounts and consolidating assets. Grandpa barely knew what an asset was. Brandon had the same tone he used to use when he convinced kids to invest in his failed sneaker business. I decided to check with Grandpa's neighbor, who often saw the visitors. She said Brandon had been coming by during weekdays too, sometimes with a folder, sometimes leaving with one. The next weekend, I found out Brandon had opened a new email account for Grandpa. Told him it would make things easier. I looked through the inbox and saw receipt, subscription changes, and a message from a legal document service. My heart sank. Grandpa said Brandon told him lawyers charge too much, so he had found a cheaper way online. I confronted Brandon that same night. He laughed, said I was paranoid and jealous because he finally decided to step up. He told me Grandpa trusted him more because he actually spent time with him. I said trust built on lies was not loyalty, it was theft. He smirked and said some people were meant to manage and others were meant to teach history. From that day on, I made it my mission to protect Grandpa. I gathered every old bill and document I could find, photocopied everything, check dates, signatures, anything that looked strange. The following week, I called Grandpa's old attorney, explained what was going on, and asked him to review any new paperwork. Quietly, he agreed and told me to bring Grandpa in soon. A few days later, Grandpa called me excited, said Brandon was helping him sign something important. He mentioned it was about simplifying the will. My chest tightened. I asked if his lawyer was there. He said no. Brandon told him lawyers slowed things down. I told him to hold off until I got there. He hesitated, said Brandon was already printing the forms. I drove faster than I ever have in my life. When I arrived, Brandon was already sitting beside Grandpa, papers on the table, laptop open. He looked startled to see me. I asked what the papers were. He said, Family Matters. Grandpa looked between us, confused. I told him to give me the papers. For a second, Brandon stood up, tried to block me, saying I was being dramatic. Grandpa's hands were shaking. I looked at him and said he did not need to sign anything until he understood it fully. Brandon grabbed his coat and left, muttering that I was ruining everything. Grandpa looked tired, unsure of who to believe. I stayed with him that night, watching him fall asleep in his old recliner, the television humming softly. I sat there staring at the papers on the table, my heart pounding. That was the moment I realized this was no coincidence. Brandon was not helping Grandpa. He was preparing to erase everyone else from his life. The next morning, I made a decision. I would not wait for him to make another move. I would gather proof, I would get the lawyer involved, and I would make sure this story did not end with Grandpa's signature on a lie. 2 weeks later, Grandpa called me early in the morning. His voice sounded both proud and nervous. He said Brandon was helping him update his will and that it was time to make things official. I froze on the spot. Grandpa never trusted paperwork, never signed anything important without running it by me first. I asked if his lawyer was involved. He said Brandon told him there was no need for that lawyers only complicated things. My chest tightened. I grabbed my keys and drove straight to his house. The moment I stepped inside, I felt something different. The curtains were closed, the air smelled like coffee and printer ink. Brandon was sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open and a pile of documents neatly arranged beside him. Grandpa sat across from him, wearing his old reading glasses, looking exhausted, but trusting. Brandon looked up just long enough to smirk before focusing back on the screen. He said they were finishing some financial forms that I would not understand. I walked closer. Anyway, I asked Grandpa what was going on. He said Brandon was helping him simplify things. Fewer names, fewer confusions. That phrase echoed in my head. Fewer names meant someone was being cut out. I asked to see the papers. Brandon immediately reached over them, blocking my view. He said it was private between Grandpa and him. Grandpa hesitated, looked at both of us, and said he just wanted to make sure things were clear before anything happened. I knew exactly what Brandon had convinced him to do. I sat down next to Grandpa, pretending to stay calm, but my heart was pounding. I told him he did not have to sign anything that day, that it would be better to have his lawyer review everything. In the morning, Brandon leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and laughed. He said, I was always overreacting, that Grandpa was finally thinking about the future. He turned to Grandpa and said, I was jealous because I had never been good with money. Grandpa looked torn, confused by our tension. He asked Brandon if the papers were really necessary. Brandon nodded, said he was only trying to protect the family legacy. I noticed Brandon's laptop screen flashing with a digital signature page. Grandpa's full name was already typed out, waiting for confirmation. I reached over and shut the laptop. Brandon stood up instantly, his voice rising. He accused me of trying to control everything. He said I never visited enough, that I only showed up when there was something to gain. I told him this was not about me. It was about Grandpa understanding what he was signing. Grandpa looked down at the table, clearly overwhelmed. I took a deep breath, trying not to let anger take over. I told Grandpa calmly that he had every right to decide what he wanted, but that it should be done properly through a lawyer. Brandon snapped again, asking why I always made things complicated. He started packing his laptop, muttering that I was trying to ruin everything. Grandpa asked him to stay and talk, but he ignored him, stormed toward the door, and slammed it behind him. The silence that followed was thick like the air after a storm. Grandpa sat there rubbing his temples. He looked smaller than I remembered. I pulled the papers closer and glanced through them quickly. They were full of legal jargon about estate transfers and beneficiaries. Brandon's name appeared more than once. I explained to Grandpa that nothing should be signed without professional advice. He nodded slowly, said maybe I was right, but that Brandon had seemed so helpful lately. I told him manipulation often looks like help at first. Before I left, I made Grandpa promise to keep the documents safe until we could meet with his lawyer the next day. He agreed, tucked the papers into his desk drawer, and gave me a tired smile. As I walked out the door, I saw Brandon's car parked down the street, engine still running. He was waiting, watching. I met his stare for a second, and then drove away with a knot in my stomach. I knew this was far from over, and that the next move had to be mine. A month later, Grandpa passed away quietly in his sleep on a Thursday morning. The nurse said he looked peaceful, like a man who had finally found rest. We buried him beside Grandma in the small cemetery behind St. Peter's Church, just as he had wished. The sky was gray and the air smelled of pine. Brandon stood a few rows away, wearing dark glasses and pretending to wipe tears, but his eyes were dry. He shook my hand afterward, told me Grandpa would have wanted us to get along. I said nothing. I was still replaying that day at the kitchen table and the papers I had pulled from his hands. The following week, the lawyer called for the will reading. It was scheduled at his downtown office with oak furniture and framed diplomas on the wall. I arrived early, holding Grandpa's old pocket watch, the one he used to time the Sunday roast. Brandon arrived 10 minutes late, stepping out of a black Mercedes in a new navy suit and shiny brown shoes. He smiled like a man walking into a job interview. I could tell he thought he had one before the meeting even began. The lawyer, an older man with silver hair, greeted us politely, then opened a folder thick with papers. He adjusted his glasses and began reading. According to the most recent amendment signed last month, Mr. Harold Jenkins leaves his entire estate, including the house and all assets, to his grandson, Brandon Jenkins. For a moment, I could not hear anything else. The words floated in the air, heavy and unreal Brandon leaned back in his chair, hands folded over his stomach, wearing a grin that belonged to someone who had been planning this for months. I wanted to shout to throw the watch at him, but the lawyer's next words stopped me cold. However, a letter was attached to this amendment. The lawyer unfolded a separate paper. It states that this document replaces a previous, one currently under investigation for potential forgery. The room fell silent. Brandon's grin disappeared, replaced by a flicker of panic. He asked what the lawyer meant. The lawyer explained that a few weeks before Grandpa's passing, the nursing home staff had filed a report about suspicious visits and documents being signed without proper supervision. The report had been forwarded to the legal office overseeing elder care cases. Grandpa's nurse had even mentioned that one visitor had brought his own laptop and printer. I looked directly at Brandon. His face had gone pale. He started insisting that it was a misunderstanding, that Grandpa had wanted things simple. The lawyer ignored his protests and continued speaking calmly. The estate will remain frozen until the investigation is complete. No transfers or sales can take place at this time. Brandon stood up and demanded to see the letter, but the lawyer raised a hand. Sit down. Mr. Jenkins, you are advised not to interfere with ongoing legal procedures. Brandon sat down slowly, eyes darting around the room, searching for a way out. I could see the sweat gathering on his forehead. He tried to regain control, talking about Grandpa's supposed wishes, about how he had been the one caring for him. Near the end, the lawyer listened without expression, then closed the folder and said the meeting was over. Outside the office, Brandon caught up to me on the sidewalk. He grabbed my arm and hissed that I'd set him up. I told him he had done that to himself. He threatened to sue me for defamation. I told him he would need money for that and walked away, leaving him standing there red-faced in the cold. Within a week, everything started to unravel. His so-called new house purchase fell through after the bank flagged his funds for review. Investigators froze his accounts pending the elder exploitation inquiry. The business partners who had trusted his charm started distancing themselves. Social media posts of him bragging about success disappeared overnight. The nursing home cooperated fully, providing logs of every visit, including times Brandon had been alone with Grandpa. A handwriting analyst compared signatures from the new will with older documents and confirmed discrepancies. The more they dug, the clearer it became that Grandpa had been manipulated. By the end of the month, the local paper ran a small article about an ongoing investigation into possible financial misconduct involving an elderly citizen and a relative. I recognized Brandon's silhouette in the photo. Even though the name was withheld, he called me once, left a voicemail saying I ruined his life. I did not call back. That night, I sat at Grandpa's kitchen table, where it had all started. The papers were gone, replaced by a framed photo of him and Grandma, smiling from decades ago. I wound the old watch and listened to its steady ticking, filling the silence of the house. It felt like justice breathing quietly between those walls. For the first time since this began, I felt calm. Grandpa's legacy had not been erased. It had only been protected, and Brandon finally had to face what happens when greed writes checks character cannot cash. 3 months later, the investigation ended with the truth laid bare. The forged amendment Brandon had convinced Grandpa to sign was declared invalid. Grandpa's original, the one written years before, remained in full effect. The house went to me, and the rest of his savings were divided equally among the grandchildren. The lawyer called me personally to say Grandpa's records showed integrity from start to finish. That sentence stayed with me, because integrity was the one thing Brandon never understood. Brandon vanished almost immediately after the ruling. His phone number stopped working, his emails bounced back, and every trace of him disappeared from social media. Someone later mentioned he had gone to Arizona, saying he wanted to start fresh, but I knew that meant escaping embarrassment. He had built his identity on manipulation, and when that collapsed, there was nothing left to stand on. I spent the following summer at Grandpa's house, fixing what time and neglect had worn down. The paint was peeling on the porch rails, so I sanded them by hand, just like he used to when he taught me how to do things right. I replaced the mailbox that leaned to the side and mowed the overgrown yard until the scent of cut grass reminded me of childhood Saturdays when I found Grandma's old gardening tools in the shed. I planted the same roses she loved, bright red with sharp thorns, because she always said beauty needed boundaries. Each morning, I would sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, listening to the sound of cicadas and passing cars. The house felt different without Grandpa's voice calling from the kitchen, but in a strange way it still felt alive, maybe because truth leaves a kind of echo, a quiet reassurance that even when things break, they can be rebuilt. There were moments when anger tried to return. I would remember Brandon's smirk at the while reading, or the way he dismissed me like a child who did not belong in adult conversations. But that anger never stayed long. It was replaced by something quieter, gratitude that I had listened to my instincts, that I had not ignored the signs, gratitude that justice had worked, even if it came slowly. Sometimes people think betrayal comes from outsiders, from people who never knew your story, but the worst betrayal was a familiar face. It uses your memories against you. It knows exactly how to twist the part of you that still wants to believe in family. That was the hardest lesson, to learn that love, without caution, can become a weapon in the wrong hands. As the months passed, I stopped checking for updates about Brandon. I no longer cared where he went or what he told people. The only thing that mattered was that Grandpa's legacy was safe. His house no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like peace, the kind that comes after long storms, when the air finally clears and you realize you survived without turning bitter. One evening, as the sun set behind the trees, I found one of Grandpa's old letters tucked in a drawer. It was short, written years before he had written that family is not just who you share blood with, it is who stands beside you when silence is easier than truth. I folded that note and placed it inside the pocket watch he left me. Then I sat back on the porch, breathing in the scent of roses, knowing the lesson had finally settled. Protecting family is not only about love, it is about courage, the courage to confront lies, to guard the people who cannot see danger coming, and to walk away when trust is broken. For the first time since this began, I felt free. Grandpa's house was no longer just his home, it was mine too, a symbol of what happens when honesty outlasts deceit.